Thank you all very much for attending our inaugural lecture in this inaugural series. My name is Randy Abate. I'm the director of the Institute for Global Understanding, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event. And the other co-sponsor is the Urban Coast Institute, directed by Tony Mcdonald. So I'm going to offer just a few quick opening remarks, then turn things briefly over to Tony for a welcome message, and then I will introduce Wil and we can get started. So this lecture series is something we're very excited about. By the name of the series, it really captures what the co-sponsors bring. So global is on the IGU's side of the equation. The Institute for Global Understanding at Monmouth was established in 2002, but relaunched just last year after a brief hiatus. And I was appointed director in March of this year. And our goal is to promote education and awareness of global affairs issues and cross-cultural understanding on and off Monmouth University's campus. And I joined Monmouth in 2018, and part of my initial appointment was an affiliated faculty with the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth, which is very well established, celebrating its 15th year, and a director who has been there that whole time in Tony Mcdonald. And Urban Coast Institute is certainly representing the ocean part of this global ocean governance series. And so it's an exciting partnership to bring both of our networks to a very important time to be thinking about global ocean governance issues. And we have an interesting and exciting line of lectures set up for this year, one more in this semester, and then likely two more in the spring. So please stay tuned. They will be advertised on the web pages of both of our institutes, the Institute for Global Understanding and the Urban Coast Institute. We're very excited to see 100, in the vicinity of 100 registered attendees for this event from 12 countries. So it's a great way to kick off the series, and I'll turn things over briefly now to Tony Mcdonald for a welcome from the Urban Coast Institute.
Thank you very much, Randy. We are just incredibly excited to have Wil joining us today to kick off this series. As Randy mentioned, my focus is on marine and coastal issues, and I quite literally believe that oceans really connect us all in every way. And this is an incredibly exciting time to think about the oceans. We hear a lot about the ocean problems, ocean acidification, pollution, other issues. But really, I think we fail to fully appreciate the important role oceans play in literally everything we do, the air we breathe, thinking about generally how oceans are really the lungs of the planet and the interconnectivity. So I really think Wil is a wonderful speaker to help break down some of the assumptions about ocean ecosystems, which really is interaction of natural and human systems, terrestrial, atmospheric, and oceanic. The ocean is not a distant thing. It's something incredibly crucial to our future. And I think thinking about these issues is really something that we have a unique opportunity to do. I'm fortunate as a member of the National Academy of Science Ocean Studies Board to be a part of the National Committee looking at the UN Decade for Ocean Science. So again, I think really we have a commitment internationally, and hopefully we'll have an emerging US commitment to the important role that oceans play. And thank you, Randy, very much for co-hosting the series and working with us to bring these issues front and center to what all of we do. So with that, I'll turn it back to Randy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Wil Burns as our inaugural lecturer in this series. I was trying to calculate the math of how long I've known Wil, but it's been a while. It's certainly traces back at least 15 years, and through it all, Wil and I have overlapped quite a bit in our interest, our mutual interest in ocean governance, in climate change, and more recently in climate geoengineering. Wil has far surpassed me in the latter category as a national and global expert on climate geoengineering, and I've been always very interested to follow what he has been up to in this field very much pursuing cutting edge and important initiatives, most recently in his role as co-executive director of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. Wil started his career, at least earlier in his career, was very actively involved in marine governance issues, was the editor of the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy, and so his expertise is perfectly situated to kick off our global ocean governance series. He's got all the bases covered, from the global governance to the ocean management to the climate change domains in his toolkit for what he brings to us as an expert on these issues, and something that, as I'm sure Wil will tell you, just probably less than a decade ago, the geoengineering discussions were very much involving the scientific crackpots who weren't allowed in the negotiating rooms, and now it is front and center, very much a part of the package of climate mitigation efforts worldwide. So very timely and fascinating topic for us to hear from Wil on today. So Wil, it's great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Very much for that introduction, Randy, and thanks to both you and Tony, as well as Monmouth University, for affording me the honor of helping you kick off this new series. So the Paris Agreement, as everyone knows, entered into force in 2016 with the salutary objective of holding temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius, and at least aspirationally holding them to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, if you look at the pledges, the nationally determined contributions that parties have made to date, we are not on track for temperatures of well below 2 degrees Celsius. Indeed, we now project that temperatures could rise somewhere between 3.2 and 3.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And given the inertia of the climate system, temperatures would be slated to rise, continue to rise for centuries thereafter. And temperature increases of this magnitude could be potentially disastrous in terms of human institutions as well as ecosystems. If we look at a 3-degree increase in temperatures, for example, this could result in a complete melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And this ice sheet's melting alone could raise sea level by about 7 meters or 20 feet. The good news is that would take probably 1,000 years. The bad news is that we would be locked in with that sea level rise for thousands of years thereafter. With a 3 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, virtually all of the world's coral reefs, which provide sustenance for about 1/3 of all ocean species, could disappear by the end of the century. A 3 to 4 degree increase in temperatures could potentially imperil as many as 60% of the world's species. A 3 degree increase in temperature could result in substantial reductions in crops, especially in some of the most vulnerable countries in the global south. And it could also visit huge amounts of disease upon the globe. So the specter of climatic changes of this magnitude have led us to start looking at potential interventions that could buy us time as we seek to actively decarbonize the world's economies, or help us draw our carbon dioxide levels back down after we pass these critical thresholds. And these fall under the broad rubric of something that we call climate geoengineering. And I provide here a couple of working definitions, but essentially deliberate, large-scale interventions in the Earth's systems to seek to counteract climate change. And when we talk about geoengineering, we usually talk about two broad categories. The first of these categories is what we call solar radiation management, or SRM. These are approaches that seek to reduce the amount of incoming solar radiation. We call this insolation. And by doing so, there is less radiation to be trapped by greenhouse gases at the surface, and that reduces radiative forcing or warming. The second approach is radically different, and it's called carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. CDR seeks to remove some of the carbon dioxide that we've spewed into the atmosphere. By doing so, it reduces the amount of greenhouse gases that can trap outgoing radiation, and again, exerts a cooling impact. As Randy suggested at the outset, many of these approaches were at Am I unmuted now, Randy? Okay. Many of these approaches were at one time considered taboo, but as you can see here, many scientists as well as policymakers in recent years, largely out of desperation, I have to admit, have started to talk about the potential role of geoengineering processes. Now, for many years, the focus was primarily on terrestrial approaches, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and direct air capture and afforestation and reforestation. However, more recently, we've come to acknowledge the fact that those approaches deployed at very large scales could be potentially unsustainable and perhaps not sufficient to reduce warming as much as necessary. And as a consequence, there's been more of a focus recently on the potential role of the world's oceans. And that's the focus of my presentation today. So here's how we'll proceed. First of all, I'm going to look at some of the solar radiation management-based ocean geoengineering options that have been discussed, looking at potential risks and benefits as well as challenges of deploying these technologies. Second of all, I'm going to look at carbon dioxide removal options utilizing the same analysis. And then finally, I'm going to look at governance approaches for both research and potential deployment of these technologies with a focus at the international level. Okay, so let's start off and look at a couple of the proposed solar radiation management approaches that could take place in the world's oceans. And the first of these we look at is something called marine cloud brightening. Researchers led by John Latham and Stephen Salter have advocated dispersing large amounts of saltwater sulfates in the area of low-level maritime clouds. And the idea here is that these sulfates would increase the nucleation of those clouds and thus their brightness. These researchers have estimated that you could increase the brightness of these clouds by about 1.8%, and that would be sufficient to return temperatures back to pre-industrial levels. How would we disperse that kind of salt water into these clouds? The researchers have proposed utilizing these kinds of vessels. These are GPS unmanned guided spray vessels that would traverse the world's oceans and disperse salt water into clouds on an annual basis. And the researchers estimated that a working fleet of about 1,500 of these vessels would be necessary to stabilize temperatures at current levels. However, there's a number of challenges and risks associated with this technology. One is we simply don't know if it would work. Largely is in the realm of the theoretical at this point. And those of you that have worked in the area of climate know that the area in which we have the most uncertainties is in terms of cloud properties. So some studies have indicated that this approach could potentially substantially reduce temperatures in the future. Some have indicated that it would have virtually no impact. There have been some studies that have indicated that it could actually increase temperatures in the long term. So we'd have a long ways to go in terms of doing field research and expanded research in this realm. Also, there are potential risks associated with this approach. It might substantially alter regional precipitation patterns as a consequence of cooling the temperatures. It could potentially substantially reduce rainfall, for example, in areas such as Southeast Asia during the monsoon season or the Amazon. Also, the reduction of available light and ocean temperature could substantially alter carbon uptake by oceans and change seawater chemistry in terms of upwelling and mixing. And as a consequence, this change in nutrient flow and distribution could have substantial impacts in terms of the structure of ecosystems in the world's oceans. The second solar radiation management approach that's been proposed are the use of microbubbles or foam. In 1965, one of the first committees in the United States that talked about climate change proposed to President Johnson that climate change might be occurring and that the way to deal with it was to, quote, spread very small reflecting particles over large oceanic areas to enhance oceanic albedo. In 2011, Harvard scientist Russell Seitz expanded upon this concept and concluded that the generation of reflective microbubbles over a portion of the more than 300 million square kilometers of fresh and salt water on Earth could potentially offset all radiative forcing associated with the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. And Professor Seitz suggested that these, what he called hydrosols, could be produced by methods such as expansion of air through placement of the ocean or generation of bubbles through vortex nozzles with vessels. But there are challenges and risks associated with this approach also. First of all, it's unclear if this approach could generate the kind of albedo that some of the models have suggested. One major challenge is that the bubbles would have to persist for days to weeks, or perhaps we would perhaps need huge amounts of vessels to be able to generate the number of bubbles that we're talking about. Also, this would likely require the addition of chemical compounds called surfactants, but the ability of these compounds to enhance albedo has only been tested in laboratories. So this is an extremely speculative technology at this point. There's also potential risks associated with this. First, it could potentially exacerbate ocean acidification by increasing the efficiency of absorption of CO2 in the oceans. Also, there's potential environmental impacts associated with these artificial surfactants that we talked about above. Also, there's potential impact on oceanic species through generating temperature effects and reduction of sunlight, which could affect photosynthesis in some species. Okay, so that's an introduction to the solar radiation management approaches we're talking about. Now we're going to move on to carbon dioxide removal approaches, efforts that seek to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The one that has been most discussed, for which there's been actual field research, is a technique called ocean iron fertilization, or OIF. So the essence of understanding ocean iron fertilization is to understand the role of phytoplankton and their role in sequestering carbon in the world's oceans. So phytoplankton obtain carbon through the process of photosynthesis, just as terrestrial plants do. And indeed, half of all of the photosynthesis that occurs on Earth occurs in the world's oceans. Now, most of this carbon that's taken up by phytoplankton is immediately released at surface and ends up back in the world's atmosphere. But a small portion of that phytoplankton will stay with these species as they die and drop to the bottom of the world's oceans. At that point, the carbon dioxide can be sequestered for hundreds of years at this point in a process that we call the biological pump. Proponents of ocean iron fertilization argue that there are areas of the world's oceans, primarily in the Southern Ocean, that have optimal levels of critical macronutrients, such as phosphorus and nitrogen for phytoplankton production, but have a shortage of a critical micronutrient, and that being iron. And so they've proposed distributing ferrous sulfate powders in these areas to stimulate phytoplankton production. And they argue that by doing so, you'll have a substantial increase in the uptake of carbon dioxide. In some of the early studies, they estimated that stimulating phytoplankton production could actually reduce concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by as much as 25%. But there's a number of questions associated with this technology. One, is it likely to be effective? Now, as I said, we've had some field research in this context, and in a number of those studies, we've seen profusions of phytoplankton when we've seeded small areas with iron. But the real question is do these phytoplankton drop below the photic layer to a point where we are ensured that there will be sequestration of carbon dioxide ultimately? And the jury is definitely out in this context. In many of these field studies, what we've seen is that most of this phytoplankton has been almost immediately consumed at surface by zooplankton, right? There's this profusion of phytoplankton. It's like a sushi bar if you're zooplankton. So in many cases, most of that phytoplankton has been immediately consumed. The zooplankton have been consumed by higher order species, and that CO2 has been released back into the atmosphere. So you're not getting sequestration, right? So that's one major challenge. However, there were a couple of these field studies that indicated that a large portion of this phytoplankton did drop below that photic layer, and you could anticipate substantial amounts of sequestration. So this remains a contested concept. However, as research has deepened, the estimates of how much CO2 could be taken out of the world's atmospheres has declined from 25% to more recent studies that have indicated that perhaps it could reduce concentrations by about 20 to 30 parts per million by the end of the century, which is substantially less. There's also, as you can imagine, large risks of putting large amounts of iron into sensitive ecosystems. One of the risks is that if you get a proliferation of phytoplankton, you can't pick and choose what kind of phytoplankton you get. And it's possible that you could have large proliferations of phytoplankton that weren't palatable by the zooplankton in those areas. If this were to happen, you could have a biological trophic cascade, right, with the zooplankton numbers declining and the higher order species relied on that zooplankton also in turn declining. And we have some empirical evidence of this. One of the field studies of ocean iron fertilization, there was a large proliferation of one kind of phytoplankton species, Phytocystic antarctica. And that species was indeed not palatable by the zooplankton in that region. So if this were to be done at a basin-wide level, for example, you could have a huge and potentially irreversible restructuring of the ecosystem in that area. So that's a major concern. Second concern that we have is that by increasing the uptake of nutrients in the areas in which this iron would be distributed, it could rob downstream areas of those nutrients. And this would have geostrategic implications in terms of declines of fisheries in other areas and conflicts that might arise from that, and obvious social justice implications. And then finally, and paradoxically, ocean iron fertilization could actually exacerbate climate change. The reason is that when these phytoplankton die, it creates anoxic environments in which there could be large production of methane and nitrous oxides, right, which are much more potent greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide. And some studies have indicated that this offset the benefits of ocean iron fertilization or could actually result in a net increase in warming. Proponents of this approach argue that given its potential, further research is necessary, and there are discussions of more ocean iron fertilization experiments in the future, including off of the coast of Chile. All right, second approach that's being discussed is called ocean alkalinity enhancement. So chemical weathering is a natural process that continuously erodes away rocks in our landscapes and sequesters all of the world's carbon dioxide over the course of millions of years. Enhanced ocean alkalization is a process that's intended to accelerate this process by adding alkaline substances to seawater to enhance the ocean's natural carbon sink. These substances could include silicate-rich minerals such as olivine or basalt, or artificial substances such as quicklime. Adding alkalinity to the ocean removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through a series of reactions that convert dissolve carbon dioxide into stable bicarbonate and carbonate molecules. This in turn causes the ocean to absorb more CO2 from the air to restore equilibrium. Another option could be accelerated weathering of limestone, which involves dissolution of limestone in a reactor with seawater and CO2-rich gases, and then ultimately reintroducing that seawater into the world's oceans. One of the other potential benefits of this approach is that it could also help address the evil twin associated with rising levels of CO2, which is ocean acidification by increasing alkalinity, though the extent that this would occur remains speculative. So what are some of the challenges and risks associated with this approach? Well, first of all, it's unclear how much sequestration of carbon dioxide would happen. Studies are all over the place at this point. They have different methodologies, different assumptions of the levels of scales that we might be able to deploy this, and as a consequence, their conclusions vary widely. One study concluded that at most, we could draw down atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide by about 30 parts per million, whereas some other studies have indicated that by 2100, we might be able to reduce levels by somewhere between 160 to 450 parts per million. So obviously, with these kinds of disparities and estimates, there'd have to be a lot more research to try to validate the effectiveness of this approach. Another challenge is the large cost associated with this technology. It's been estimated that this could cost about $3 trillion or more to deploy, with ongoing costs thereafter. There's also risks associated with this approach. For one, the process could disadvantage marine organisms that aren't able to concentrate carbon within their cells under conditions of increased alkalinity, such as littoral crabs in one recent study. It could also cause spontaneous precipitation of calcium hydroxide in some cases, and this could adversely impact coral reefs, which are particularly sensitive to high levels of turbidity, as are other species of the world's oceans. Also, the addition of non-carbon alkaline materials to the oceans could alter primary and secondary production. So it could increase contaminant accumulation in food chains via the release of minerals such as cadmium, nickel, chromium, iron, and silicon. And again, this would have to be assessed starting at small scales and then ramping up those kind of assessments under high conditions of uncertainty. Another carbon dioxide removal approach that's being discussed is called artificial upwelling. Artificial upwelling seeks to stimulate primary production in marine environments by drawing nutrient-rich waters from beneath the photic zone to the surface. As is the case with ocean iron fertilization, what it seeks to do is to stimulate phytoplankton production and thus amp up the biological pump. A range of devices have been proposed that might be able to facilitate this process, including airlift pumps and wave-powered systems. But there's challenges and risks associated with this approach also. First of all, the drawdown of carbon dioxide that might be effectuated could be relatively modest. One study has indicated that it might at most draw down a gigaton or 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. To put this in perspective, many scientists now believe that if we're to hold temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, we're not only going to have to aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but remove somewhere between 10 to 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So this would clearly be potentially a small contributor. The second issue are some of the risks. The drawdown of CO2 into marine environments could again exacerbate ocean acidification. One study has indicated that it could decrease ocean pH by about 0.15 units beyond the present projections of ocean acidification. Artificial upwelling could also substantially restructure ocean ecosystems. It could favor large phytoplankton, for example, such as diatoms, and result in a shift from nutrient-poor to nutrient-rich species. It's unpredictable what that structuring of the ocean ecosystem would mean. Okay, So that's a broad overview of some of the approaches. Now I want to briefly talk about how we might regulate these approaches in terms of research and in terms of potential deployment. My emphasis here is going to be on international institutions. But what I want to emphasize is that in many cases where these approaches might be deployed, for example, in coastal regions, there would obviously be a substantial role for national, state, and even local law in some cases. At the international level, we've had two regimes that have already intervened to seek to regulate marine geoengineering research. And these were both in response to the 13 ocean iron fertilization experiments that occurred to date. The first of these is a treaty called the London Dumping Convention, which was created in the 70s to address dumping of materials into the world's oceans. And in 2008, it passed a resolution on ocean iron fertilization, which indicated that parties could only engage in ocean iron fertilization for quote unquote legitimate scientific research, meaning that they couldn't seek to obtain credits, such as on the voluntary carbon market, for this approach. It also indicated that there should be a risk assessment framework that would be developed by the parties. And ultimately, in 2010, they established a risk assessment framework that was to be utilized by the nationals of any party that would seek to engage in small-scale ocean iron fertilization experiments. Now, there are limitations to this approach in terms of regulating these ocean-based approaches that we've talked about. First of all, this resolution was focused only on ocean iron fertilization. So presumably, if other approaches were contemplated, this framework might be applied in those contexts also. Another limitation is that it would only apply to marine-based options that involve placing matter in the world's oceans, right? And so it's unclear that it could regulate all of the approaches that we talked about. For example, our microbubbles, placement of materials in the world's ocean. Some would argue they are not. If you added the surfactants, the things that seek to increase their stability, perhaps you could say they were. Marine cloud brightening, most likely not an approach that could be regulated under the ocean upwelling. The placing of pipes, for example, in the world's oceans, the placement of materials. These are all questions that would have to be sorted out, but that would limit this regime's ability to regulate these approaches. Now, the London Dumping Convention also has a contemplated successor regime that's called the London Protocol. And in 2013, the parties to the London Protocol passed a resolution that would potentially have more bite. For one thing, it would amend the protocol, meaning that these requirements would be legally binding upon the parties, unlike the resolution that was passed by the London Convention. Second of all, while its permitting process would be initially limited to ocean iron fertilization, it contemplates that all marine geoengineering activities, which it defines broadly here, could be ultimately regulated and added under its scope. So it's much broader than what we saw in terms of the London Dumping Convention. But it also has some limits too. First of all, this amendment only comes into force when it has at least 34 of the current parties accepting it. And at this point, only 5 parties have. So it could be a very long time before this amendment becomes legally binding. Second of all, the London Protocol only binds 51 countries, and this doesn't include one key potential actor when it comes to marine geoengineering, and that's the United States. And then finally, again, because it's limited to placement of materials in the world's oceans, it wouldn't necessarily be able to regulate all of the approaches that we're talking about. The second regime that has intervened in the context of ocean iron fertilization was the Convention on Biological Diversity. And they also passed a resolution in 2010 that it is broader. It talks about geoengineering, climate geoengineering, and could thus encompass many of the approaches we're talking about. And it again indicates that this research has to have a scientific basis, can only be small scale, and is subject to a thorough prior assessment. Okay, but again, CBD resolutions are not legally binding. The CBD has not been particularly effective as a regime, and its focus is mostly on biodiversity impacts and wouldn't encompass some of the other concerns, including human health, that might be associated with some of these approaches. What other regimes might also intervene in the future if research in marine geoengineering were to escalate or potential deployment would be contemplated? Well, one obvious one is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, under Articles 238 and 239, there is a call for promoting marine scientific research, which could privilege research in the context of some of the approaches that we are talking about. At the same time, if this research would be contemplated to occur within the territorial or exclusive economic zones of countries, it would be regulated by those regimes, right? And they would have the decisions in terms of the scope of that kind of research and indeed if that research would proceed. What would happen in terms of this research in beyond the exclusive economic zone? Well, Article 257 talks about states having the right to engage in research beyond the exclusive economic zone, which is a pretty wide remit. At the same time, there are limitations and checks. As Article 263 says, states are responsible for ensuring that marine scientific research does not violate provisions of the treaty, and it provides for liability in cases where that might occur. One of the areas that would be particularly pertinent then is Article 194, which talks about the obligation to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment. So if some of these approaches were deployed, for example, and were to result, for example, in ocean acidification or release of toxic minerals in the case of ocean alkalinization enhancement, for example, it could constitute a violation of Article 194, and it could result in liability, which could include the need for reparations as well as compensation to the parties that might be injured. Related to the Convention on the Law of the Sea is a treaty that's being developed under it called Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ. And BBNJ also has a number of provisions that might be pertinent to regulation of these approaches. First of all, it's contemplated that on the open oceans, there will be marine protected areas that have been established. And it might be possible that the scope of protections of these marine protected areas would preclude research on some of these marine geoengineering approaches and might potentially also even forbid some of these from occurring. Also, BBNJ contemplates environmental impact assessments, including consultation with other parties that might be affected. And then finally, the Paris Agreement could obviously be pertinent. One question is could you incorporate marine geoengineering into your pledges, your nationally determined contributions to addressing climate change? Article 4 indicates that the NDCs require the parties to pursue domestic mitigation measures, though it doesn't define the term mitigation. However, the Framework Convention, its parent agreement, does define mitigation to include limiting emissions and protecting sinks and reservoirs. So sinks are things that sequester carbon. So I think it's pretty clear that at least in terms of the carbon dioxide removal approaches that we've talked about, the parties probably could incorporate those into their NDCs in the future. No party has to date, but there has been some early discussion of doing so. Solar radiation management approaches, however, do not appear to encompass within the realm of mitigation. And the parties would have to either amend the treaty or this would have to come in a different form. The other thing is that whether the parties claimed marine geoengineering as part of their NDCs or not, if they were to deploy it, there are other provisions of the treaty that would also be pertinent in terms of potentially regulating what kinds of marine geoengineering approaches could be deployed and at what scale. This is preambular language, and so it's not legally binding, but presumably would help guide the parties in looking at these approaches. So as you can see in the preamble, it acknowledges that parties may be affected not only by climate change, but the impact of measures taken to respond to climate change, right? And so clearly, it provides the parties with a right to scrutinize how we respond to climate change, and marine geoengineering would clearly be a suite of responses. Notably, it talks about the need to ensure the integrity of all ecosystems, including oceans, and the protection of biodiversity. So to the extent that some of these approaches could either further that objective by helping us to address climate change, or could undermine that objective in terms of the risks that we talked about, parties presumably would have a right to scrutinize those approaches in the long term. And then finally, the preamble talks about, in the context of responses, looking at equitable access to sustainable development and eradication of poverty. So again, we could look at these approaches and see if they help further these objectives or might undermine them in some cases, including potential impacts such as on the world's fisheries. It's unclear, of course, as is always the case, if parties would comply with these provisions, but it at least provides is some moral suasion in the long term as we seek to regulate these technologies. And then finally, there are other regimes that we would have to look at: the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement, regional regimes such as the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, if we were to deploy these technologies in the Antarctic region, and customary international laws, such as the need for transboundary environmental impact assessment and the precautionary principle. And I'm going to stop there and just say that it is likely, given our inability at this point, or at least our lack of commitment to reduce our emissions to the point that are necessary to meet the Paris Agreement, that we will look increasingly at some of these options. And so it will be critical for society to assess the trade-offs that may occur and to try to put governance mechanisms in place that help us to ensure that if these approaches are deployed, they're done in a way that is environmentally optimal and also look at issues of equity and social justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wil, for that very informative and wide-ranging presentation. We have a few questions in the chat. I wanted to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off with one that I put in there and tie it back to OAE because this is certainly the one strategy that I'm least familiar with. So it seems like much of what you described is kind of where the international community has been for at least 5 years, and I'm thinking with the IPCC's warnings of having 12 years to engage in effective global climate mitigation. Is OAE being perceived as the safest bet, the one that's most likely to be deployed, even if only at a small scale, to make some headway in this major challenge we're facing with climate change?
I think at this point, OAE is mostly still a glimmer in the eyes of scientists. Most of what we have done to date is laboratory based. There's not even much in terms of mesocosm studies at this point, certainly not large scale sort of field experiments. A lot more would need to be done to characterize potential uptake of carbon, and probably more importantly, to characterize the risks associated with these approaches. As I said, some of these silicates, for example, could release things like nickel and chromium. It could also increase turbidity in a lot of these areas. We'd have to assess what the scale of those impacts are, and then also seek to assess which areas in the oceans would be optimal for given conditions for utilizing these. So I think we're a long way off. I also think there need to be a huge discussion with the public about these kind of interventions. My experience with climate geoengineering is that the public is most resistant to any approach in the global commons. That includes in the atmosphere, proposals, for example, to put sulfur into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight away. It created substantial amounts of controversy early on in the discussion of climate geoengineering. I suspect any discussion of large-scale interventions in the world's oceans might also generate substantial public resistance. And so I think what would be necessary is to engage the public in talking about the risks and also the trade-offs, right? I mean, the reality is that there's no such thing as a free lunch at this point, right? Unchecked climate change will, and it already is, having profound impacts on the world's oceans, right? And so it's not like we can simply say, well, we'll have no interventions and everything will be just fine, right? And so we need to honestly engage with the public, I think, and talk about that fact and try to gauge what level of risk aversity the public may have and what level of acceptance they might have of these approaches going forward. But I think if we just try to deploy and without that kind of discussion, we might get a huge backlash that would make it impossible to realistically deploy these technologies in the future.
Thanks, Wil. There was actually two questions from Professor John Tiedemann. He's our Assistant Dean in the School of Science and Director of our Marine and Environmental Biology and Policy Program. John, did you want to ask I think your first question may have been addressed regarding the governance. You can ask the second one about the EEZ and the CZM.
Yes, you did address I had said what international treaties might apply, which you covered well. I'm wondering if any of these technologies were to be deployed in the United States exclusive economic zone, I'm assuming even though they're under an international treaty, we have the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act that would have to have a program set up for permitting. And then also if it's inshore, I'm assuming that coastal zone management consistency consultations might also apply. Is that correct, Wil?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. One of the approaches that's talked about in the context of ocean alkalinization enhancement is spreading materials such as olivine in coastal beach areas, for example, because those coastal beach areas would create substantial amounts of abrasion and help to break down these minerals and increase the reactivity surfaces, right, which is what you want in terms of weathering. And if you were to do that, though, if you were to propose that you're going to put it on U.S. beaches, there would be a massive number of potential domestic regulations that would come into place. As you suggested, the Coastal Zoning Management Act, to the extent that this tidal and subtidal areas would be at least within 3 nautical miles in most areas, and then more in the Gulf, would be under the rubric of the states. You would have to have a consistency statement under the Coastal Zoning Management Act. If you were to potentially create conditions that would release toxic minerals in those areas, the Clean Water Act would also have to be complied with. If you were going to use if you were going to create powders that could be inhaled, for example, if it were below 10 microns, right, you could also have the Clean Air Act, and some of the state implementation plans even regulate air pollutants above 10 microns, right? So depending where you did it, you might have Clean Air Act involved. If you were to use waste materials such as slag or fly ash as some of the materials that you were using for alkalinization. You also might have RCRA involved in this process. And then, of course, the states have their own coastal regulations over and above what the feds have, and a lot of times local areas have permission to establish their own regulations, and all of those would have to be complied with. Also, environmental impact assessment under NEPA, right? Obviously, if you were scaling up to a large scale, would also have to be complied with, and that might also implicate things like the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and so forth, if there were potential impacts on species in those areas. So yeah, and this would be true in any country, right, in which you would potentially deploy this. Though one thing I'd say editorially, one of the concerns I have about these approaches is, you know, I just rattled off a large number of US regulations, many of which have existed for a long time, of which there's a lot of scientific expertise that can be brought to bear in terms of these assessments and so forth. Even in the United States, there's some, you know, resource limitations in being able to do this. But in developing countries, right, where some of these proposals have been, I have a lot of concerns about the ability of enforcement facilities in those countries to be able to conduct these kind of assessments in a way that ensures protection of their marine environments. But that would clearly have to be done.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wil. We're running out of time. I just wanted to remind everybody, especially those who joined late, that this presentation will be recorded and posted on both Institute websites, and Wil has kindly offered to share the slides as well as a reference moving forward. I think we should have time for one more question, and Tony Mcdonald, who's an expert on the London Convention and Protocol, has a question for you.
So yeah, thank you very much, Wil and everybody, for this. I guess I have a question or comment or questions masquerading as a comment, which is, you know, I think the reality is this has come a long way in the last 10 years, and the potential for this is not just theoretical. I think that's, in my mind, there are a lot of doubts, but it does seem to me that the scale of the potential for this is something that strikes me as something that has the potential to meet the scale of the climate challenge, where many of our other adaptations suggestions are really, you know, what I would call more local interventions. So I do feel that we should give this serious attention, because of, if we really do believe that the scale of the climate challenge is as great as we think it is. And that then leads to my more specific question, which is just, does seem to me that the current regimes like the London Convention, which you know, switched from a kind of a gray list, which is presumed that certain things could be disposed, to a blacklist, which essentially presumes things weren't, couldn't be dumped at sea without certain guidelines and criteria that were approved. Not really set up, as are the CBD and the other conventions. Those are really conservation and protection regimes, which are actually fundamentally important, but I don't feel like either of them have the kind of, or the ones I'm familiar with, have the kind of structure to enable the kind of interventions that you're suggesting through your different frames. So it would seem to me that there needs to be a fairly fundamental shift, like just as the London Convention shift from a kind of a permissive regime to a restrictive regime. What would a regime which would actually regulate this as an activity, and how at the scale that you're kind of talking about?
Yeah, and I think London could ultimately do that, right? Some people have characterized these resolutions passed by the regime as a moratorium on marine geoengineering research, right? And it clearly is not. What it says is, until there's adequate governance mechanisms in place and adequate scientific knowledge, it's restricted to small-scale research. But it contemplates and provides a framework to facilitate small-scale research, right? So I think it's a mischaracterization. It also contemplates, if we can develop those governance mechanisms and the research bears fruit, that we potentially could establish the kind of regulatory regime that you're talking about. And I think the protocol that we talked about that could regulate all of these could provide that kind of framework in the longer term. But it's going to require some resources to step up this kind of research, and it's going to require responsible actors to ensure that we comply with what I think are salutary requirements in terms of risk assessment that's called for out of the regime.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Dr. Jason Adolf in our Marine and Environmental Biology and Policy Program and an expert on harmful algal blooms has a question.
Hi, Will.
Hi.
Thanks for the great talk. It's great to hear about these geoengineering trials. I'm much more familiar with ocean iron fertilization. I've worked with phytoplankton for, I don't know how long now, 20 some years. It seems to me that ocean alkalinization has a lot of the same issues in terms of, the unintended effects and of adding stuff to the ocean. And one thing I can't wrap my head around is, does that depend on physical transport out of the surface ocean, the way ocean iron fertilization does, in order to really sequester the carbon that's taken up?
It doesn't. It contemplates a changing surface equilibrium, and thus facilitating more uptake of carbon dioxide and conversion to carbonate and bicarbonate. Ultimately, those carbonates and bicarbonates are transported, right? But the initial uptake of carbon dioxide doesn't contemplate that process.
So that it's fair to say that the chemical change is meant to be, like you said, a new equilibrium. So it's chemically changing the surface ocean long term.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's scary to think of doing that on a large scale, but I do support research into those methods. Like you said, there's mostly laboratory research, and I do think we need to keep these options on the table and understand them better. But I would hate for anyone to think that they were a magic bullet for solving the climate crisis, because
I would hate to think that too. As I said, I view climate geoengineering, not all of my colleagues do, but I view it largely as technologies of despair, right? The fact that we have to look at these interventions because we didn't get our act together and do what would have made a lot more sense, right? Which was to rapidly decarbonize and never have to contemplate the use of these kind of interventions. But we didn't, and now we have to look at these approaches in earnest, in my opinion. But we should by no means should view them as magic bullets. And of course, it always bears saying, if you don't aggressively decarbonize, these approaches can never save you, right? Because all that would mean is you would have to escalate the use of these technologies in the longer term, and then all of the potential risks that we talked about in themselves escalate, right? If you don't rapidly decarbonize in the long term, these approaches are not only not your savior, but they potentially create an even worse result in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for a great talk.
You're welcome.
Thank you again, Will. This has been fantastic. A really great start to our new Global Ocean Governance series, and we're grateful for your input and your expertise, and hopefully we will continue to stay in touch on these issues with both of our institutes aligning with your work moving forward. Tony, you have any last word?
Oh, thank you very much. And there's a lot to do, and it's great to have folks joining for this conversation. And stay tuned for the subsequent sessions.
Thank you all for attending.